So I've said that there are two puzzles that we'll work through this semester, at least two puzzles that we'll work through this semester. And the first one that I pointed out was how can we explain why U.S. Social welfare policies in the U.S. welfare state differs so much from other rich democracies. The other one, and it's related, is what happened over the past 40 years to make things worse for many population groups rather than better. So here is one visual representation of that second puzzle. So look at the dark blue bars here. So what this shows is that in the post-World War II period, the economy was growing at a relatively high rate, and more importantly, I think, or perhaps as importantly, the benefits of that growth were distributed relatively equitably across the population, with, as you can see here, the poorest 20% of the population actually doing a bit better than everybody else, although, again, everybody is doing well in this 1947 to 1979 period. Now look at the medium blue bars there. That's showing the last 40 years or so up until the Great Recession. So that's 1979 to 2007. So this isn't taking into account the effects of the big recession we're just ending, right? So notice two things. First, there's less growth overall. And second, that growth is no longer being distributed equally across population groups. In fact, in this period, the bottom 20% of the population gained no ground at all. And the higher you were up the income ladder, the better you did. Now, finally, look at those light blue bars there, at what's happened since the Great Recession up through 2013. What do you see? Right? So the only place where we see any, first of all, negative growth, right, rather than slow growth or high levels of growth. And the only place where you see any increases in income at all is among wealthier groups, and especially among the very, very wealthiest. And I think this is in some ways the key economic fact of our age. And I think that historical comparison is important for us to keep in mind, right? We can look at other nations to consider the other possible policy options we have in front of us. We can look at our own history too, to see other avenues that might create an economy and a system of social welfare policies that more broadly benefit populations across income groups. So here's the related way of looking at this trend, right? So this shows the share of all income that is captured by just the richest 10%. You can see this peak in 1929, and then the trough, right, in that immediate post-war period, and then a recent return now to those 1929 levels, right, in which the top 10% is gaining almost a majority of all income. Now that little dip in the chart there, right, that sort of post-war period, that's the same period as the dark blue bars in the previous one, right? So that's why inequality matters in one level, right? There's another way of looking at this is the bottom 90% versus the top 10%. Since World War II, looking only at periods when the economy is expanding after a period of recession, right? So again, if you look at that, the left side of that chart there, right? Those earlier years in the post-war period, during expansions, when the economy is growing, you actually see the bottom 90% of the population gaining in the 49 to 53 period, right? 80% of all income, right? So you see sort of rough correlation between population share and how much of the economic expansion they're benefiting from. Right, again, look at that most recent period all the way to the right, and this is looking at just 2009 to 2012, post-Great Recession, right? Negative growth, right, loss of net income for the bottom 90% of the population, and all growth captured by the top 10%. But now only looking at the richest decile, the top 10%, this is something that's important. So this is looking at even richer slice, the top 1%, and this is looking just at the last 35 years or so. And then there's what happened to the middle class, that middle 60%, and the poorest 20% below. almost no gains at all for the bottom 80% of the population, while the very richest prospered. And here now is looking at the very, very rich, the top 1/10 of 1%, and then the top 1/100th of 1%. And this we are now learning, thanks to some recent research, some of which you'll be reading, it's actually the group that has gained the most in the recent period. And again, look toward the bottom there. Look at comparison about what's happened to everybody else. Look at that line for the bottom 90%, essentially flat. And again, here we're looking at income growth since World War II, and now it's the top 1% versus everybody else. And again, and this is from one of the scholars who has been one of the pioneers in the recent research that has put some real sort of meat on the empirical, we've always had this sense that we were in a period of widening inequality, but Gabriel Zucman and Thomas Piketty, among others, have done the most to really give us the data to bolster this and to show just how dramatic the change has been. This is, I think, why the Occupy Wall Street movement and the critique associated with it resonated so much with so many people. And I think also why, if you think back to both the Bernie Sanders primary campaign and to now President Trump's presidential campaign, I think this is some of also why their economic critique resonated so much, is that the complaint is very much rooted in an economic reality, even if the Occupy folks understated the division, right? It's the top 1/100th of 1% versus the 99.99%. Really, that's more like what happened, rather than merely the top 1% versus the rest. But make no mistakes, right? That's real. That's not merely political rhetoric. That, given the data that we have available to us, is an accurate description of the world that we inhabit. And here's one of the reasons why this matters. So what this chart shows is that increasing inequality is itself one of the reasons that we've seen declining mobility. It's not an accident. They are related, although I should point out that we are still debating what precisely those mechanisms are that connect inequality and mobility. And finally, here's one more way of looking at this powerful trend. Which countries' citizens were richest when? And as you can see, as late here as 1980, all Americans, except for the poorest 5%, were wealthier than their counterparts in these other countries. That's no longer true. By 2010, only Americans above the median, above the midpoint, are doing better than similarly situated people in these other places. There are a growing number of nations where many or most people would be better off than in the US. And we need to come to terms with that, to accept that fact first, to explain how it came to be second, and then finally to figure out what we do about it. This is a broader summary of some of the other trends of this post-war period. We don't really have a name for it yet. Right, and I can pause for a little bit, or you can pause and maybe glance through some of these indicators. So as we wrap up, here's another important international lesson. Right, this growing inequality, this is happening in Europe too, this increasing inequality, even if the magnitude is still different there. So that sort of all together brings us to that second puzzle, right? Remember, the first one is, why is the United States so different across so many dimensions than from so many other rich democracies? And the second, why have things gotten even worse over the past 40 years? Why do we no longer live in what was once called the golden age of American capitalism? What do you think? And how about for this question? What do you think?